The air that hit me at Jacksonville International was not the dry, scorching heat I had become accustomed to overseas. It was thick, wet, and heavy, clinging to the starched collar of my Navy uniform like a shroud. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and the scent of rain and cheap jet fuel filled my lungs. 8 months of deployment, 8 months of calculated risk, relentless precision, and enforced emotional suppression had finally ended. I was exhausted, mentally hollowed out, but there was a singular, painful clarity in my mind. Duty is done. Now, I can mourn. The weight of my father's absence pressed down on me immediately. He should have been here. He was always here, regardless of how short my leave was or how late the flight landed. I felt the familiar, deep ache of loss, a dull, constant throb that adrenaline had kept muted for half a year. I told myself I would go home, sit in his leather armchair, and finally allow myself the luxury of tears. I picked up the rental car, a forgettable gray sedan that felt alien after months spent in armored transports, and drove the familiar 20 miles toward the suburbs. The route was etched into my muscle memory. The turn off the highway, the winding oak-lined streets, the specific scent of jasmine and cut grass that signaled I was almost there. As I rounded the final corner onto Magnolia Lane, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, a fragile mix of anticipation and dread. Then I saw the house. It was wrong. The house itself stood where it always had, a sturdy colonial with white siding and dark green shutters. But everything surrounding it was subtly, jarringly different. My father had been an avid, messy gardener, favoring wild roses and overflowing hydrangeas. Now, the flower beds were gone, replaced by severe geometric shrubs, too manicured, too sterile, like a picture from a magazine, utterly devoid of personality. The front door had been repainted an unfamiliar, cold shade of slate gray. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching on gravel that had been freshly replaced. I turned off the ignition, and the resulting silence was unnerving. This house, my sanctuary, usually hummed with the ghosts of laughter and the soft tick of my father's grandfather clock. Today, it was utterly silent, radiating an unsettling emptiness. I reached into my pocket, my fingers finding the familiar, comforting weight of my old brass house key. I slid it into the lock, the same lock I'd used since I was a teenager sneaking in past curfew. It didn't turn. I wiggled it gently, then tried again, applying more pressure. The key wouldn't seat properly. The mechanism was entirely different. It wasn't just stuck. The lock had been replaced. A cold, sick dread settled in the pit of my stomach, heavy and immediate. I tried the spare key, the one I kept on my keychain out of habit. It didn't work either. Panic started to prickle at the back of my neck. I walked quickly around the porch to the stone planter where, since 1998, we had kept the emergency key hidden beneath a hollowed-out concrete rabbit. I lifted the rabbit. The space beneath was empty, scoured clean. My mind raced, trying to formulate a rational explanation. Maybe Brenda, my stepmother, had simply upgraded the security system. Maybe she was out running errands and forgot to tell me the new code. But the sterile landscaping, the repainted door, it all screamed of intentional, calculated change. I pulled out my phone, my hands suddenly clammy, and dialed Brenda's number. She answered on the third ring. Her voice, when she spoke, was sharp and impatient, utterly devoid of the overly sweet, saccharine tone she usually adopted when addressing me. "Yes?" she snapped. "Brenda, it's Alex. I'm home. I'm at the house. My key isn't working, and the spare is gone. What's going on?" There was a pregnant pause on the line, a silence that stretched taut with malice. "Oh, Alex, you're back already? I suppose you should wait outside. I'll be right there." She hung up without another word. I waited on the front walkway, the humidity making my dress whites stick uncomfortably to my skin. I felt the incongruity of my position. A lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, standing on the curb of my own home, waiting for permission to enter. When Brenda finally opened the door, she didn't step aside. She stood framed in the doorway, blocking the threshold. I saw her immediately, and my stomach clenched. She wasn't wearing morning black or even subdued colors. She was draped in a sleek, dove-gray silk ensemble that looked like it had been purchased from a boutique on Rodeo Drive. Her hair was freshly highlighted, and she wore a heavy, unfamiliar gold bracelet that looked suspiciously like the one my father had given my mother decades ago. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a woman who had just won the lottery. "Well, hello, dear," she said, her smile brittle, not reaching her eyes. "Brenda, please, what is happening? Why did you change the locks? I need to get inside. I need my things. I need to see." I couldn't finish the sentence. I needed to feel my father's presence again. She cut me off, her voice dropping to a low, chilling register. "Alex, there's been a change of circumstances. I didn't think you'd be back so quickly." She didn't invite me in. Instead, she stepped onto the porch and handed me a single folded sheet of thick legal paper. Her fingers brushed mine, and they felt cold, like marble. "Your father was deeply in debt, dear," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. It was a terrible shock to me, too. He revised his will just weeks before he passed, leaving everything to me, his devoted wife, to manage the creditors. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the cold, legalistic summary. The language was boilerplate, but the content hit me like a physical blow. It claimed my father had been forced to liquidate assets and had revised his long-standing trust, leaving me nothing but a handful of personal effects that had already been boxed up and were waiting in a storage unit miles away. Then I saw the dates. The revised will was supposedly signed and witnessed 3 weeks after I had deployed to the Persian Gulf. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. "That's a lie," I heard myself say, the words flat and devoid of emotion. "That's a complete lie. My father was meticulous. He was debt-averse to a fault. More importantly, he had established a comprehensive trust 15 years ago, specifically designed to protect my inheritance from probate challenges, and frankly, from any future gold diggers who might enter his life after my mother's death. He had always told me, 'This is your legacy, Alex. This is protected.'" "Don't be dramatic, Alex," Brenda sighed, rolling her eyes. "Grief makes people unreasonable. It's all perfectly legal. The house has already been closed last Thursday. I'm moving out in 2 days, and the new owners take possession. The house was sold. My sanctuary, my home, the last physical connection to my father, was gone." I stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as my father's wife, but as a predator who had systematically stalked and stripped his estate while I was thousands of miles away, serving my country. She had waited until I was completely unreachable, submerged in the duties of deployment, before making her final, devastating move. Her efficiency, her cold calculation, was what truly stung. "You manipulated him," I whispered, the realization solidifying into granite certainty. "You forged this. You knew I couldn't challenge it from where I was." Brenda's composure finally cracked. Her lips thinned into a venomous line. "I don't know what nonsense you're talking about. You need to leave this property now, Lieutenant Commander. I will call the police and have you escorted away if you cause a scene." She retreated back into the doorway and slammed the heavy slate-gray door shut, the sound echoing the finality of my loss. I stood there, motionless, on the freshly manicured lawn. My duffel bag, still bearing the chalk markings from the tarmac, sat at my feet. The pristine white of my uniform suddenly felt heavy, ridiculous, and utterly useless. I was a decorated officer, trained to navigate complex global crises, and yet, here I was, standing on the curb, homeless, financially ruined, and utterly betrayed by a woman who had spent the last 5 years pretending to love my father. The grief I had been holding back did not come as tears. It curdled, transforming into something cold, hard, and corrosive. It was pure, focused rage. She hadn't just stolen money, she had defiled my father's memory and exploited my commitment to service. I looked up at the house, memorizing the cold gray door and the severe shrubs, the symbols of her conquest. I knew instantly that this was not over. She had declared war on me, and she had made the critical mistake of thinking a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy wouldn't fight back. I picked up my duffel bag, the weight of my life now confined to a single canvas cylinder. I walked back to the rental car, my back ramrod straight, refusing to look back. I was financially ruined, but I was not defeated. I had a uniform, a network, and a commitment to justice forged by years of service. Brenda had just ensured that I would leverage every single asset at my disposal to tear her carefully constructed lie to the ground. The fight had just begun. The heavy metallic taste of betrayal lingered in my mouth long after I had driven away from the house that was no longer mine. I had spent the last 2 years navigating minefields and hostile waters. I never expected the deepest ambush to occur on my own front lawn. I drove until the street signs blurred, eventually pulling up to the cramped apartment complex where my old Naval Academy classmate Mike lived. Mike was now out of the service, running a high-end security consultancy, but he was still the definition of loyalty. I called him from the curb, swallowing my pride. "Jenkins? What the hell? I thought you were back on base clearing leave," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "I am back," I replied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "But I don't have a place to stay tonight. It's complicated." Mike didn't ask questions. He simply told me the apartment number and the door code. I felt the sting of humiliation as I dragged my duffel bag, the same bag that had traveled halfway around the world with me, up 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs. The next few weeks were a blur of discomfort and simmering rage. I slept on Mike's lumpy, pull-out couch, surrounded by his civilian clutter, boxes of tactical gear, old pizza boxes, and the faint, persistent smell of stale coffee. I, Lieutenant Commander Jenkins, who had commanded a crew of hundreds and managed millions in federal assets, was now a guest, constantly feeling the need to apologize for my existence. Every morning, I woke up before dawn, driven by the rigid schedule of my deployment, only to be confronted by the terrifying lack of structure in my life. I couldn't access my money. Brenda had moved with surgical precision. I spent hours on Mike's laptop, trying to log into my father's old investment accounts, only to be met with error messages or security questions I couldn't answer because the contact information had been changed. She had sealed me out completely. I felt the sting of her efficiency, realizing how meticulously she had planned this theft while I was focused on protecting my country. The first lawyer I hired, a civilian probate specialist named Mr. Henderson, did little to assuage my panic. His office was plush, suggesting high fees, and his demeanor was dismissive. I laid out the facts: the original trust, my father's meticulous finances, my deployment, and the sudden, suspicious, revised will. Henderson leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a diamond-encrusted pen against a glossy file folder. "Lieutenant Commander, you have a strong emotional case, but a weak legal one. Your stepmother successfully probated the new will. The moment the court validated it, the clock started ticking. You missed the window for immediate contestation while you were overseas." He detailed the complexity. Challenging a will requires proving either undue influence, mental incompetence, or outright fraud. Each path was costly, requiring expert witnesses, forensic accountants, and months, if not years, of litigation. "And the cost?" I asked, my throat tight. He smiled thinly. "To challenge a trust of this size, you're looking at a $50,000 retainer, minimum, just to start discovery. And given that your stepmother is currently liquidating assets, she has a massive war chest to fight you with. You, on the other hand, appear to be highly illiquid." His words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the panic rise, seeing the legal system stacked against me, designed to protect the rich and the fast-acting. Brenda had not only stolen my legacy, she had used the very system meant to protect it as her shield. I walked out of that office feeling utterly defeated, the civilian world proving to be a dangerous and unforgiving place. That evening, staring at the ceiling of Mike's apartment, I realized I was approaching this all wrong. I was trying to fight a war with borrowed civilian weapons. I had access to a better arsenal. I had earned it. The next morning, I drove to Naval Base San Diego. The moment I passed the gate, showing my ID and receiving that crisp, familiar salute, a wave of profound relief washed over me. I was home. I was back in the world where rules, honor, and loyalty still meant something. I walked straight to the administrative building and requested a meeting with my former commanding officer's executive officer, Commander Hayes. Hayes was surprised to see me, but professional. I skipped the emotional narrative and delivered the facts in a concise 3-minute brief, the kind of briefing I'd deliver before a critical operation. While deployed, my father's estate was fraudulently stripped by my stepmother. The timing suggests deliberate planning around my absence and my duty to the Navy. I need legal counsel that understands the implications of a service member being targeted while fulfilling their oath. Hayes didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone. "I'm sending you to JAG, Captain Miller. He handles high-profile fraud cases. Go now." I found Captain Miller's office tucked away in a sterile, organized wing of the legal building. The atmosphere was quiet, efficient, and devoid of the flashy pretense of the civilian lawyer I had just dealt with. Miller was a man in his mid-40s, his uniform perfectly pressed, his eyes sharp and analytical. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered focus. I sat across his heavy oak desk and laid out the entire story, starting from the moment my father married Brenda 4 years ago, detailing my long-standing suspicion of her opportunistic nature, and ending with the cold, hard reality of the locked door and the fraudulent will. I handed him the single sheet of paper Brenda had given me, the summary claiming my father was in debt. Miller's questions were pointed and precise, cutting straight through the emotional noise. "Did your father have a separate trust established before the marriage?" "Yes, Captain. Irrevocable. It named me as the sole beneficiary." "When was the new will signed, according to this document?" 3 weeks after I deployed to the Persian Gulf." "Did you have any contact with your father during that period that indicated a change in his financial planning or mental state?" "None. He was stable, fiscally prudent, and vehemently against debt. The debt claim is a fabrication." Miller leaned back, steepling his fingers. He looked not at me, but at the documents, weighing the evidence with the gravity of a man planning a complex military operation. "Lieutenant Commander Jenkins," he began, his voice calm but authoritative. "When a service member is deployed, they are afforded certain legal protections, specific to cases where their absence places them at a disadvantage in civil proceedings. What your stepmother did wasn't just probate fraud, it was a calculated attempt to exploit a combat officer's duty to the nation." He paused, his eyes finally meeting mine. They held a deep, professional resolve. "This is no longer just a civilian probate dispute. You were serving your country. We will find out exactly what happened, and we will use every resource the Judge Advocate General's Corps has at its disposal to restore your legacy and hold this woman accountable." I felt a massive, tangible weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just the promise of legal help. It was the affirmation that I was not fighting this battle alone. The U.S. Navy, the institution I had dedicated my life to, was now on my side. I was no longer a grieving daughter sleeping on a friend's couch. I was an officer whose rights had been violated, and my command was mobilizing for war. The fight was about to get very official, very meticulous, and very unpleasant for Brenda. I knew, looking at Captain Miller's unwavering gaze, that her reign of greed was nearing its abrupt and painful end. Chapter 3: The Relentless Hunt. The immediate aftermath of meeting Captain Miller was not a sudden, dramatic charge into battle, but a grueling, methodical descent into paperwork. If deployment taught me anything, it was the necessity of process, and Miller was the absolute master of procedural warfare. I had expected a lawyer. I received a highly organized, relentless intelligence officer disguised in dress blues. I spent the next several weeks living in the sterile, air-conditioned confines of the JAG office on base, a stark contrast to the humid, dusty environments I had recently navigated overseas. My life became a cycle of document review, deposition preparation, and endless cups of lukewarm coffee. Miller's office was not flashy. It was functional, dominated by a massive whiteboard and filing cabinets that hummed with importance. I was tasked with providing the context, the color, the intimate knowledge of my father's life that the legal documents lacked. I pulled old financial statements, insurance policies, and, most importantly, the original estate planning documents drafted years before Brenda entered our lives. Miller insisted on starting from zero, treating every assumption as a potential weakness. "We don't just prove she lied, Lieutenant Commander," he explained one morning, his voice low and precise as he highlighted a section of an outdated mortgage agreement. "We prove how she lied, when she lied, and why your father's true intent was irrevocably clear." I felt like an archaeologist, painstakingly brushing away the dirt covering my father's true intentions. Every receipt, every canceled check, every investment prospectus I unearthed was a testament to his meticulous nature. He was a man who planned for the long term, who despised debt, and who had established that trust decades ago specifically to ensure my security, regardless of who he married later in life. Seeing his careful planning laid bare made Brenda's actions feel even more monstrous. She wasn't just stealing money, she was desecrating his legacy of prudence and love. The work was emotionally exhausting. Every time I had to confirm my father's signature on a legitimate document, I was reminded of his steady, confident hand. Then I would compare it to the signature on the fraudulent will, the one that supposedly left everything to Brenda. The disparity was obvious to me, fueled by grief and familiarity, but Miller needed proof that would stand up in court. That proof arrived in the form of Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic document examiner the Navy flew in from Quantico. Thorne was quiet, wearing thick glasses and a perpetually skeptical expression. He set up his equipment in a small conference room, a specialized microscope, high-intensity lighting, and a camera linked to a large monitor. I sat beside Miller, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs, as Thorne began his analysis. He placed the original, legitimate will next to Brenda's revised version. On the screen, my father's real signature appeared, sharp and flowing, the lines consistent, the pressure steady. Then, Thorne zoomed in on the signature on the fraudulent document. "Observe the micro-hesitations," Thorne murmured, his voice amplified by the microphone as he maneuvered the specialized stylus. "See the slight tremors, particularly here, in the downstroke of the J in Jenkins." He pointed to a tiny, almost imperceptible waver. A naturally executed signature is fluid, often executed in muscle memory. This, however, shows several points of unnatural pause, where the hand hesitated, likely lifting slightly from the paper, then resuming. This is highly indicative of tracing or forgery by simulation. He spent the next 20 minutes systematically detailing the flaws. Inconsistent pen pressure, the telltale blurring where the forger tried to rush the movement, and the subtle angle deviations that my father's signature never exhibited. The conclusion was delivered with chilling professional detachment. The signature was unequivocally a forgery. I felt a fierce, cold satisfaction spread through my chest. That small technical detail, a tremor, a pause, was the first crack in Brenda's elaborate facade. She had planned everything, but she couldn't fake my father's hand. Miller leaned over and whispered, "One down. Now we attack competency." The next major hurdle was dismantling Brenda's claim that my father was mentally sound when he supposedly revised his will. The fraudulent document included a certification from a local doctor confirming my father's mental competency shortly before his death. Miller knew we couldn't just challenge the competency. We had to prove the certification itself was fraudulent. He tracked down the specific doctor, a general practitioner named Dr. Sterling, and we scheduled a visit. Walking into Dr. Sterling's private office felt surreal. It was plush, quiet, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and expensive leather. Miller handled the conversation with his usual surgical precision. He presented the doctor with the date and time listed on the competency certification that Brenda had submitted to the probate court. Dr. Sterling, a kindly-looking man in his 60s, looked genuinely perplexed. He consulted his records, tapping away at his keyboard. "Mr. Jenkins?" he asked, confirming the name. Yes, he was a patient, but I haven't seen him for over a year before his passing. Miller showed him a copy of the notarized certification form. Dr. Sterling's face tightened with sudden alarm. This signature, that's not mine, he stated firmly, shaking his head. And the date listed here, October 15th? My office was closed that entire week. I was attending a medical conference out of state. My staff can confirm it. The medical records Brenda provided to the court were entirely falsified. She hadn't just forged a signature, she had manufactured an entire medical timeline, using an innocent doctor's name to lend credibility to her theft. I felt a sickening mix of horror and vindication. Brenda hadn't just stolen money. She had actively desecrated my father's final days, inventing a narrative of his mental decline and subsequent recovery just long enough to sign away my inheritance. The idea that she fabricated evidence concerning his health while he was dying sent a wave of nausea through me. She possessed a coldness that was truly terrifying. With the will and the competency certification proven false, the legal foundation of Brenda's claim collapsed. But we still had to find the money. Miller brought in the financial team, a small unit of Navy accountants and forensic auditors whose job usually involved tracking defense contracts and rooting out waste. Now, they were focused solely on the civilian financial trail of Brenda Jenkins. The whiteboard in Miller's office quickly became a bewildering map of transactions. It was covered in circles, arrows, dates, and names of entities I had never heard of. Shell corporations with names like Aurora Holdings and Triton Trust. I watched, fascinated and appalled, as the team detailed the process of financial displacement. Immediately after the fraudulent will was probated, Brenda had liquidated nearly all of my father's liquid assets. The money didn't go into a simple savings account. It was routed through a complex web designed for obfuscation. She used a classic layering technique, one of the financial auditors, a sharp young lieutenant named Patel, explained, pointing to a series of transfers. First, the money goes from the estate account to a domestic holding company she controls. Then, that company makes a series of small, rapid transfers to offshore accounts, specifically the Cayman Islands and Nevis. I stared at the diagram, the lines illustrating the scale of her greed. This wasn't a desperate act. This was a calculated, professionally executed laundering scheme. She had hired specialists, or at least used sophisticated methods, to ensure the money disappeared into jurisdictions where retrieving it would be notoriously difficult. The sting of her efficiency was sharp. She had planned this entire operation while I was thousands of miles away, relying on the integrity of the system she was actively corrupting. The good news, Miller interjected, tapping the whiteboard with a dry erase marker, is that while offshore accounts provide protection from seizure, they don't provide anonymity from the IRS, or, in this case, the Department of Defense's investigative resources. They had managed to trace the funds through intermediary banks, leveraging international treaties and the sheer authority of the U.S. government when it decided to look closely. The path was complicated, but the destination was clear: a massive private trust, controlled entirely by Brenda, sitting safely outside U.S. jurisdiction. The investigation culminated one afternoon when Miller called me into his office, closing the door behind us, a rare move that signaled the gravity of the moment. He looked tired, but intensely satisfied. He laid a single sheet of paper on his desk, sliding it toward me. It was a wire transfer receipt. "This is the final piece of the puzzle, Lieutenant Commander," he said quietly. The transfer that emptied the last major portion of the trust account, totaling just over $3 million. I leaned down and stared at the receipt. The date was glaringly highlighted in yellow marker, June 12th. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. I remembered that date vividly. June 14th was the day I stepped onto the tarmac in San Diego, the day my deployment ended, the day I was supposed to drive home and start mourning my father. She had timed it. She knew exactly when my plane was due to land, when I would be transitioning from military duty back to civilian life, and when she would lose the shield of my absence. She emptied the vault just in time to greet me with the locked door and the fraudulent paperwork. I stared at the paper, absorbing the cold, calculated timing of her actions. It wasn't just theft. It was a final, deliberate act of malice, designed to ensure my complete devastation the moment I returned home. She had leveraged my service, my dedication to my country, as the perfect cover for her crime. My grief, which had been simmering beneath the surface of the investigation, now boiled over, transforming into pure, concentrated resolve. The fight was no longer about proving my father's love or reclaiming a house. It was about confronting a meticulously planned betrayal, a scheme hatched in the shadow of my uniform. I looked up at Captain Miller, who watched me with an expression of professional empathy. "We have everything we need," I stated, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "When is the hearing?" "Next Tuesday," Miller confirmed. "Get your dress whites ready, Lieutenant Commander. We're going to court." I stood there, the wire transfer receipt feeling heavy and cold in my grasp, a smoking gun fired with precise timing. Brenda had underestimated the resources of the U.S. Navy and the tenacity of a daughter wronged. She had enjoyed her stolen wealth and her false sense of security for far too long. The hunt was over, and the confrontation was imminent. I was ready to face her, not as a grieving victim, but as the officer who had built the case against her. The air in the courtroom was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of old paper, leather, and the nervous tension of high-stakes litigation. I remember the sound of my own footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor as Captain Miller and I walked toward our table. I was wearing my dress whites. The uniform felt like a deliberate statement, crisp and uncompromising, a physical manifestation of the duty Brenda had betrayed. I sat down, my spine ramrod straight, and immediately scanned the room. The judge's bench loomed large, framed by dark oak paneling. Across the aisle, I saw her. Brenda. She looked exactly as she had the day she threw me off my own property, only amplified. She wore a tailored suit, expensive jewelry that gleamed under the recessed lights, and a look of practiced, cold confidence. She was flanked by two nervous-looking, slick-haired defense attorneys who kept shuffling papers and whispering into her ear. She met my gaze and offered the faintest, most arrogant smirk. She still believed she had won. She still believed my grief and my service were weaknesses she could exploit. I felt a cold, focused calm settle over me. My grief was gone, replaced entirely by a disciplined, surgical rage. Today was not about emotion, it was about precision. Miller, sitting beside me, was the picture of military professionalism. He wore a standard dark suit, but his posture and his meticulous arrangement of files spoke volumes. He didn't look at Brenda. His attention was entirely on the legal pad in front of him. He was a weapon honed for this specific environment. When the judge entered and the bailiff called the court to order, the tension ratcheted up instantly. I gripped the edge of the table, reminding myself to breathe slowly, deeply, the way I had learned before a crucial mission briefing. Miller rose, moving with an economy of motion that commanded attention. He didn't start with flowery language or emotional appeals. He started with the facts of my father's original, meticulously organized estate and the fact that I was deployed overseas, serving my country, when the alleged changes were made. "Your Honor," Miller's voice was steady and deep, cutting through the silence. "The defense will argue that the deceased, Mr. Arthur Jenkins, willingly and legally revised his trust to exclude his only daughter, Lieutenant Commander Jenkins, in favor of his spouse. We will prove this claim to be a malicious, calculated fabrication, executed through criminal fraud." Brenda's lead lawyer objected immediately, calling the statement prejudicial. Miller didn't even turn toward him. He simply waited for the judge to overrule the objection, which he did with a curt wave of his hand. Miller's first strike was devastating. He called the forensic document expert, Dr. Evans, to the stand. I watched, fascinated, as Dr. Evans, a small, meticulous man with thick glasses, presented his findings. Miller had him project enlarged, side-by-side images onto a screen for the judge. On the left was my father's signature from his original 2012 trust documents. On the right was the signature on the fraudulent 2022 revision. Dr. Evans pointed out the consistent, strong flow of my father's genuine signature, the way he always looped the J in Jenkins. Then, he pointed to the 2022 signature. If Your Honor observes the pressure points here, Dr. Evans explained, using a laser pointer, you can see significant hesitation and tremors, particularly around the baseline of the A in Arthur. Furthermore, the angle of the pen lift is inconsistent with Mr. Jenkins' known writing habits. This signature, he concluded, looking directly at the judge, was not written by Arthur Jenkins. It is a highly skilled forgery. I felt a fierce, satisfying jolt go through me. This was the first time I saw Brenda's composure truly flicker. Her jaw tightened, and she leaned over to whisper fiercely to her lawyer, her manicured hand gripping his arm. The smugness was replaced by a thin veil of terror. Miller had landed the first punch, and it was a knockout blow to their primary defense. I watched Brenda's face contort. She hadn't just stolen the money. She had tried to paint my father as a confused, senile old man who had suddenly turned against his only daughter. The sickening realization that she had desecrated his memory for profit fueled my resolve. Miller's relentless precision was the perfect antidote to her malice. The climax of the morning, however, was the financial evidence. Miller knew that proving forgery was one thing, proving intent and the depth of the theft was another. He introduced the financial team's lead analyst, who patiently walked the court through the money trail. The analyst displayed a complex, yet horrifyingly clear diagram on the screen. It showed the rapid liquidation of my father's primary assets, the trust funds, the stock portfolio, the sale of the house, and the subsequent movement of those funds. Within 3 weeks of the probate being finalized, the analyst stated calmly, over 90% of the liquidated estate was routed through a series of 3 shell corporations registered in Delaware and Panama. I gripped the table again, remembering the weeks I had spent looking at those confusing diagrams with Miller. Now, they were laid bare for the judge. Miller took over the questioning again, driving the point home. And where did these funds ultimately settle after being washed through these corporations? The analyst pointed to the final destination on the diagram. 2 primary accounts held by the same beneficiary in the Cayman Islands. Total transfer amount, $7, $8 million. Miller then presented the smoking gun, the wire transfer receipt I had seen in his office, signed by Brenda herself, authorizing the final, massive transfer. He projected the magnified signature, confirming it was unequivocally hers. Your Honor, Miller stated, his voice ringing with authority. Mrs. Jenkins did not simply inherit a debt-ridden estate as she claimed. She systematically looted an $8 million inheritance, utilized falsified documents to bypass probate, and funneled the proceeds offshore precisely 2 days before Lieutenant Commander Jenkins returned home from active duty deployment. The sheer scale of the fraud hung in the air. The sophisticated nature of the theft, the shell corporations, the forgery, the medical fraud, made her look less like a grieving widow and more like a high-level organized criminal. Brenda's composure shattered. It wasn't a theatrical collapse, but a sudden, terrifying loss of control. She whispered something sharp and desperate to her lawyer, who immediately stood up, his face pale, requesting an emergency recess. The defense had been utterly dismantled. They had no counter-argument to the truth. As the judge granted the 10-minute break, I stood up, feeling shaky but victorious. I saw the flurry of activity immediately outside the courtroom doors. Reporters, cameras. The story had exploded. The sight of my uniform, juxtaposed against the cold, calculated greed revealed in court, had turned this probate battle into a national headline. I could hear the hushed, urgent whispers: deployed veteran, stolen inheritance, greedy stepmother. I refused to hide. I stood tall, letting the cameras flash, meeting the eyes of the reporters. My fight for justice was no longer just about my father's legacy. It was a testament to the integrity of service against the corrosion of pure avarice. Captain Miller clapped me lightly on the shoulder. Excellent work, Lieutenant Commander. The facts are undeniable. I nodded, unable to speak, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I looked across the empty courtroom aisle at Brenda, who was now huddled in a corner with her lawyers, her expensive suit looking suddenly cheap and ridiculous. Her reign of deception was over. The Navy lawyer had found everything, and now the reckoning was at hand. I walked back to my seat, ready for the final judgment, knowing that my father's honor and my own was about to be restored. The sudden, sharp crack of the gavel sliced through the thick courtroom air, a sound so absolute it felt like a gunshot. I instinctively straightened my shoulders, the starch in my dress whites providing a rigid, comforting framework against the inner tremor of anticipation. The judge, a stern woman whose silver hair was pulled back into an unforgiving knot, settled her gaze directly on the defense table, ignoring the frantic whispers still issuing from Brenda's counsel. The court has reviewed the evidence presented by Lieutenant Commander Jenkins and the United States Navy Judge Advocate General Corps, the judge began, her voice steady and resonant. The findings are clear, compelling, and deeply disturbing. I held my breath, watching the judge's lips move, each word a hammer blow against the edifice of lies Brenda had so meticulously constructed. She detailed the forensic evidence of forgery, the telltale pauses in the signature, the chemical analysis proving the ink was too new. She recounted the sworn testimony of the doctor, confirming the falsification of the medical competency records. It is the ruling of this court that the will dated October 14th, signed under highly suspicious circumstances, and while the plaintiff was deployed overseas serving her nation, is hereby declared invalid and void ab initio, the judge announced. A wave of pure, unfiltered relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me sway. It wasn't just a win, it was the total erasure of Brenda's narrative. The judge continued, confirming the validity of my father's original, meticulously crafted trust and estate plan, restoring my rightful inheritance entirely. The house, the accounts, the investments, they were mine again. They had always been mine. But the true victory, the one that settled the score morally, came next. The judge leaned slightly forward, her expression hardening. Furthermore, given the deliberate and malicious nature of the fraud perpetrated against the estate, and specifically against a service member performing her duty, this court finds sufficient evidence to refer Ms. Brenda Hawthorne's case immediately to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution, citing counts of forgery, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I saw it. I saw the absolute, terrifying collapse of Brenda's composure, the smirk she had maintained throughout the proceedings, the smug confidence that her expensive lawyers and hidden offshore accounts would protect her, vanished instantly. Her face went slack, the color draining from her cheeks until she looked sickly, almost gray. Her lawyer grasped her arm, but she shook him off, her eyes wide, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. She wasn't just losing money, she was losing her freedom. I didn't feel joy in that moment, but a profound, cold sense of vindication. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered with the full, uncompromising weight of the law, precisely because I had been serving my country when she committed her crime. The judge banged the gavel one final time, dismissing the court. The room erupted into a low buzz of whispers and the clatter of papers, but I sat motionless until Captain Miller gently touched my elbow. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice flat, professional, and utterly devoid of triumph. "It's done." I rose slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was a chaotic flood of reporters and flashing cameras, drawn by the national headline this case had become, "Deployed Veteran Robbed by Greedy Stepmother." I ignored them all, focusing only on Miller. We walked side by side down the long, marbled corridor, the cacophony of the press fading behind the heavy doors. We stopped near a large window overlooking the city street, the midday sun streaming in, warm on my face. "Captain Miller," I began, struggling to find words adequate to convey the depth of my gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. You didn't just win a case. You restored my father's honor and my entire future. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond disciplined professionalism in his eyes. Perhaps a quiet satisfaction. You earned it, Lieutenant Commander Jenkins, he replied, extending his hand. His grip was firm. You were where you were supposed to be, doing what you were trained to do. The JAG Corps ensures that those who serve are not preyed upon by those who stay home. We simply did our job, and you, ma'am, provided the context, the facts, and the unwavering commitment we needed. I shook his hand, holding it perhaps a second longer than was strictly necessary. I realized then that the military wasn't just a job. It was a profound, powerful brotherhood that extended its protective arm even into the chaos of civilian life and personal betrayal. I was no longer fighting alone. The strength of the U.S. Navy had been leveraged on my behalf. That thought alone was worth more than any inheritance. It took several weeks for the legal dust to settle, for the paperwork to be finalized, and for Brenda's temporary expensive belongings to be cleared out of the house. I had to wait until every legal avenue of appeal was exhausted and the property was officially transferred back into the trust's name. The day I finally drove up the familiar driveway, my heart pounded a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I parked the rental car, retrieved my own old key, the one I had held onto through every deployment, and walked up the stone path. The landscaping, which Brenda had made so aggressively manicured and sterile, already looked slightly overgrown, a small sign of neglect that somehow felt like healing. I reached the front door, the heavy oak familiar beneath my fingers. I slid my key into the lock. It turned smoothly, clicking open with the welcoming sound of home. I pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was still, slightly cool, and carried the faint, lingering scent of expensive, synthetic perfume. Brenda's ghost. But beneath that, I could already detect the deeper, older scent of the house. Old wood, leather-bound books, and the subtle, earthy aroma of my father's pipe tobacco, long since extinguished. I walked slowly from room to room. Brenda's attempt to impose her vulgar, temporary luxury was evident in the empty spaces. She had favored gaudy, oversized furniture and loud, modern art. Now, the walls were bare, showing faint rectangles of clean paint where her terrible canvases had hung. The living room felt vast and hollow. I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the invasion was over. The house, my sanctuary, was mine again. It needed love, and it needed me to strip away the superficial layers of greed and restore its true character. I made my way to my father's study, the room I remembered most vividly. It was here he had done his best thinking, here he had planned his life, and here he had ensured my security. Brenda hadn't been able to entirely strip this room. The built-in bookshelves were too permanent. I sat down heavily in his old leather armchair, which still bore the faint indentation of his body. I ran my hand over the worn armrest, closing my eyes. I felt a sudden, profound rush of grief, the loss I hadn't been able to process while fighting for justice. Now, in the silence of his room, I finally let myself mourn the man, not just the stolen inheritance. I opened my eyes and looked around. The room was tidy, almost too tidy. I began to wander, pulling books from the shelves, hoping to find a note, a bookmark, anything that felt like him. Behind a heavy volume on international law, I found a small, hidden compartment my father had installed years ago. I reached inside and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger. This was not a legal document. This was his personal journal of investments and intentions. I opened it to the final pages. Written in his precise, familiar hand were notes detailing the exact structure of the trust, the specific accounts, and the names of the people he trusted to manage it while I was away. This, he had written next to a column of figures, is for Alex. Her service is her life now, and this is her safe harbor. It must remain untouchable. I traced his handwriting with my finger, tears blurring my vision. Brenda had claimed he was in debt, desperate, ready to sign everything over to her. This ledger, this private testament, proved the opposite. He was meticulous, debt-averse, and fiercely protective of my future. The inheritance wasn't just assets. It was his final, unwavering act of trust in me. I realized my fight had been necessary not just for my financial security, but to defend his memory from the stain of Brenda's lies. She had tried to paint him as weak, indebted, and easily manipulated. He was none of those things. He was strong, careful, and loving. I committed myself then and there to managing the inheritance with the same integrity he had shown in building it. It was a duty, a legacy I was now bound to honor. Weeks turned into months. The house began to breathe again. I replaced the gaudy paint, brought in familiar furniture from storage, and slowly, deliberately, infused the space with the warmth and history Brenda had tried to extinguish. My deployment was officially over, and I was granted a period of extended leave, allowing me time to fully transition back to civilian life while maintaining my active service status. I knew I would return to duty eventually. The structure and purpose of the Navy were too deeply ingrained in my soul to abandon. But the fight for justice had changed me. I had gone from being a grieving daughter, blindsided by betrayal, to a disciplined officer who methodically utilized every resource at my disposal to win. I had faced the darkest, most calculating greed and had seen truth and selfless service triumph. I stood on the back porch one evening, watching the sun set over the oak trees my father had planted decades ago. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the promise of a new season. I was financially secure, emotionally whole, and my father's legacy was safe. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, restorative breath of the air in my own home. I had fought overseas for the principles of freedom and justice, and I had fought at home for the principles of honor and truth. Both battles were won. I opened my eyes, ready to start my life anew, knowing that the greatest inheritance I had received was not the money, but the unwavering commitment to integrity that my father and my Navy family had instilled in me. I was home, and I was finally at peace.